Hey folks, my name is Mo Amir and this is VANCOLOUR, British Columbia's bona fide culture and politics TV talk show. We have a mind-blowing show for you tonight with an incredible guest. Her Vancouver Sun series, Lethal Exports, digs deep into how Canada has become a global refuge for drug trafficking crime networks, leaving a trail of destruction around the world with BC gangsters at the center of it all. Thanks to the Lieutenant Governor's Journalism Fellowship, you can read her entire 5-part series at thevancouversun.com for free, no paywall. One of the most courageous, incredible, and impactful crime reporters in the world. She is Kim Bolan. Kim, how you doing?
Great. That was quite the introduction, Mo.
You
Hope
came
I can
in,
live up to it.
You came in without a bodyguard. That is what surprises me the most.
Yeah, well, you have to live your life, right? Media cutbacks. There are no funds for bodyguards these days.
We'll advocate on your behalf. Now, I do want to ask you a loaded question. When we think of the global transnational drug trafficking industry, how big of a role does Canada play?
Well, it's not that we have the most numbers involved because we are a relatively small country population-wise, but we have key figures that are from Canada that are at the top of the food chain, if you will, in terms of transnational organized crime, in particular drug exports from around the world to places like Australia and New Zealand. And currently, Vancouver is a major transshipment point and export point for drugs that are made in Canada, synthetic drugs, and also for methamphetamine coming from Mexico.
Wow.
And then going through the Port of Vancouver to Australia, New Zealand, the South Pacific.
What drugs are being produced within our borders?
Well, the RCMP is now confirming that we have super labs across the country that are producing methamphetamine, which is a big commodity internationally, but also fentanyl, which is obviously a deep concern given the crisis that we've had here in Canada. The idea that we would actually export that crisis, that toxic drug crisis, to other places is really, really disturbing. And what's so interesting is that I think the general public thinks, well, it must be really hard to make these chemicals. Where do they get the ingredients, the precursors? 90% of the precursors that are used for both methamphetamine and fentanyl are legally available in Canada. They can be imported. There's no restriction at all.
Wow.
Because they're used in other industries, right?
Oh,
Legitimate
okay.
industries.
That makes sense.
They're used in the petroleum industry. They're used in plastics. So you've got a small amount, a small quantity, like 10%, that are regulated by Health Canada. But even when people apply to get permits for those, the list of people who import it doesn't get handed over to police because, again, they're legitimate business, right? So it's really difficult, I think, for the RCMP to really know how many, illicit labs there are across the country. They've busted some that are major that they know are producing more than what is being used locally.
Right.
So they have announced as of November that we're an exporter country, which is a pretty new development.
And in terms of the export, as you alluded to, Vancouver is the transshipment hub of Canada, right?
Oh, definitely Vancouver. And right now it's one of the major ones of North America.
Wow.
LA is also still big. And Mexican cartels, they have their own people here in Canada. They work with the Hells Angels. They work with the Comancheros, which is a biker gang in Australia, or as they call them, bikies.
Right, okay.
A cute little nickname they have for bikers in Australia is bikies.
It's nice marketing. Yeah.
It is. But they also work with Asian organized crime. So you might think of them as being traditional enemies. Certainly when we talk about the gang violence on the streets of Vancouver, a lot of these gangs are warring with each other. These young guys, get the tattoo of one gang, they go up against the other gang.
Right.
Internationally, they're all working together because they're making so much money when they do that.
Okay, so when they're working together, and thinking of Vancouver specifically, how do these drugs actually get exported? Like, what are some of the tricks that they're using to be able to ship them overseas?
Well, they're so sophisticated that they change it up all the time, right? So we see mostly here drugs going out in containers. Sometimes they're disguised as something. Well, they're always disguised as something else, but sometimes it's quite sophisticated. What we saw with 6 of the tons that were intercepted last year, they were disguised as canola oil. And if you saw the flats with all the canola oil boxes on it, and some of them they pulled out for us, it just looked like canola oil. You never would have known it was, in fact, liquid methamphetamine, right?
Wow.
There was also, if you can believe it, maple syrup. that was going to New Zealand that was intercepted. 713 kilos, very Canadian, right? That might have been why it was kind of suspected, like something was a bit off. And CBSA, the Canada Border Services Agency, they did detect that, right? So they do some really good work. We just don't see a lot of criminal charges laid in connection with these seizures. In addition to that, they hide drugs in industrial equipment, that is then kind of rolled on, rolled off.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And one of the things I learned about when I was in Australia, which is just like amazing, are these parasitic attachments. So you've got like a giant freighter, container ship. The people that are operating that ship, that vessel, they won't even know that organized criminals have attached something to the bottom of the ship,
really?
Right? So sometimes
incredible.
It's hidden inside these grates. They're called sea grates. They're where the water flows in and out to cool the engine.
Yeah.
But there's a big compartment under there, right? So, and sometimes they're kind of welded on, and they'll have, air tags in them, literally. And so they've got new equipment in Australia. It's this really cool little submersible made in California.
Okay.
And they throw it in, and they guide it with a joystick over to the boat, and it uses sonar. When you get close, you can look right into these sea chests.
Interesting.
And see if there are, there's anything in there that shouldn't be in there, right?
Wow. So these companies, like I'm thinking about the shipping companies, the container ship companies, I mean, these are commercial operations. We have a commercial operator operating the port of Vancouver. When you talk about these type of schemes or how they get the drugs shipped on these ships, it feels like it must be an inside job. There has to be some people on the inside coordinating this, right?
Well, definitely. That's a big issue here and abroad. I think in Australia, they did, the border agency there, the Australian Border Force, they did a big sort of investigation. And in that country alone, they found over 1,000 trusted insiders, they're called.
1,000?
1,000. People they were concerned about, that maybe they had a criminal connection, right? Maybe they had come into a lot of money recently, right? They think mostly here and in places like Australia and New Zealand, anyone who is a trusted insider is doing it because they've been offered money, right? Wow. So that's the reason why they're putting their careers at risk, right? But in places like Mexico, you probably shouldn't call them trusted insiders. The insiders are often people who've been threatened, or their family has been threatened.
Okay.
Right. So it's a very different situation. And that's why, from the research that I've done, often the cartels will want their own person working directly on the ground with the Canadians, with the Australians, with the other transnational organized crime groups, because they know that person won't betray them because they have access to their families back home.
Right.
Right. So I don't think we're in that kind of a situation here in Canada, but I know the Australian police that I spoke to were concerned that could become the norm there too.
Sure. I guess the big question is then, what can actually be done? Because I was surprised that we don't actually have a policing authority at the ports. And I was actually more surprised that there were several federal cabinet ministers that were also unaware that we didn't have a policing presence at the ports. So what can be done aside from just, putting cops at Vancouver ports?
Well, I think we need to bolster federal policing in Canada. What's happening is there are a lot of vacancies at that level. I think a lot of people have said they feel like the RCMP is a bit directionless in recent years.
Interesting.
And maybe we need to take a look at, how it's structured. Do we need a new agency? Do we need to, get RCMP out of contract policing, which is a big deal in BC, so that they have the bodies to fill some of the, senior positions in federal policing and tackle transnational organized crime. Anytime you're going for the top players, which we don't do in Canada, you're going to have a pretty sophisticated investigation. There might be undercover, there might be wiretap, but it's going to take a lot of resources, right?
And speaking of this, I really quickly, I want to talk about 2023. There was 8 tons of methamphetamine that were seized in a drug seizure here in Vancouver, and yet there have been no charges laid with regard to that seizure. So can you explain why that hasn't happened?
And the 8 tons was seized in several seizures. It wasn't all at once, but it still wasn't a record year.
Sure.
The previous 5 years had a quarter of that, right? So this was like a huge amount of methamphetamine, mostly destined for Australia and New Zealand. There are ongoing investigations. That's the thing we always get told as reporters in Canada.
Sure.
Oh, well, we can't comment because the investigation is ongoing. But I mean, it's going to always be ongoing if no one's ever charged. We do know from a report that was commissioned by the City of Delta that was done by former Deputy Commissioner Peter German. He looked at some of the issues surrounding Delta Port in particular because the city is responsible for policing the port.
Yeah.
Right? But Delta Police can't even go onto the port without getting permission first, right?
Really?
So,
Okay. Wow. That's
no,
wild.
I mean, it's, there's tight security
Sure.
to prevent us from going onto the grounds of the port, understandably. But the problem is, it's a bit of a fortress and there's stuff going on inside, right? So how do you investigate that? So Peter German's report found that in many cases, the seizures are the final thing that happens, right? That there's a referral to the RCMP because they do the criminal investigations, but, they might just call it a no-case seizure, which is a term that they use when they decide they don't have the resources to take a deeper look at that particular seizure. So, I am told that regarding the 8 tons, there are ongoing investigations, but based on past precedents, I doubt that we'll see anyone charged.
This is so wild. It's blowing my mind. We do have to take a commercial break, but when we're back, I want to talk about the devastation of Canada's drug exports around the world. Welcome back to This is VANCOLOUR. We're back with the legendary crime reporter Kim Bolan. And this conversation is supported by Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey, distinctly Vancouver Island, uniquely Shelter Point. So Kim, what role do BC drug traffickers have in the drug crisis in Fiji?
Well, they have a pretty significant role, 2 different ways. Right now, because so much of the methamphetamine has been going out through the Port of Vancouver, the route that it takes across the Pacific goes past all the South Pacific islands. These beautiful islands that are famous for tourist destinations. Sure. And particular to Fiji, which is one of the larger countries in that region with over 330 islands, a lot of the drug shippers stop there and they unload. So some of the methamphetamine is stacked, some of it's in containers, some of it's in other, kind of packaging, and they want to use smaller vessels to get it into Australia and New Zealand because then they're going to have, better luck in that some of it will get there, right? Okay. So they recruit locals to help them. Right? In Fiji, they're paying the locals with methamphetamine. So now you have this sort of new drug problem that Fiji has never had before. And it's very widespread. The United Nations is looking at doing a survey this year to figure out the extent of it. But anecdotally, everyone you talk to talks about people using methamphetamine that they know. They also are injecting the methamphetamine, right? Which is not how it would be used here. And it's very difficult to get needles there. So there's a lot of needle sharing and suddenly HIV rates are skyrocketing. Wow. So it's really, really devastating. I found a lot of users there. I talked to them. They know that the drugs are coming from elsewhere. They didn't specifically know Canada. And there are other countries involved too. I don't want to make it seem like it's only Canada. As I said, these transnational organizations are all working together. And if there was a crackdown at the Port of Vancouver, for example, the same groups would just figure out another way to get the drugs here, right? They're very sophisticated. They move. They try to stay a step ahead of law enforcement. But right now, we look like a bit of a soft point, right? And
Fiji doesn't have a lot of resources. They don't really have treatment centers or certainly police at ports to even crack down on this stuff, right?
No, there are no treatment centers. There's no treatment there at all. Wow. And there are people that would use it that if they had the option. There's also even school kids are using methamphetamine this way, injecting it, right? So it's become a very big social problem. A lot of politicians kind of had their heads in the sand over it because they think, oh, well, this meth is going on to Australia and New Zealand. It's not really here. So, but now they are kind of all acknowledging it. And even since I was there, they've now found a record 3 tons of meth hidden in Nadi, which is the big tourist destination. It was likely to be transshipped onwards, but there's no way they can ignore it now.
Right.
But they need help, right? They don't have the resources. Most of the islands in Fiji have no police or customs presence on them. so they're just really...
I feel like this underscores the responsibility that Canada has in terms of exports out of Canada. It's easy to say, oh, let's scan all the imports, but we also need to scan exports. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was this Stinchcomb case. Can you explain that and why maybe it's difficult for Canadian authorities to work with other governments in terms of cracking down on this transnational trade?
Well, when you talk to law enforcement, legal experts who are no longer in law enforcement, they say a big obstacle to working internationally with their partners to get charges laid in Canada, prosecutions in Canada, is this Supreme Court of Canada ruling from 1991 called Stinchcomb. And the ruling says, that any defendant is entitled to basically all the disclosure that the police have, even if it's information or evidence that's not going to be used in the court case, right?
Interesting.
Yeah. And, we have a charter. It's very important in Canada, but things have changed in terms of the sophistication of transnational organized crime, as well as the complexity of investigations, right? So one thing you hear repeatedly is that, all the disclosure is very, very challenging to just produce in a timely way. Sometimes it's millions and millions of documents. Police, Crown have to have the resources to get those cases to court. If there were 4, all at once, they probably couldn't handle it, quite honestly. But the real concern is that because of that disclosure rule, other countries that are providing us with intelligence where they're not allowed to disclose the source of that intelligence are fearful they might be, Canadians might be obligated to have it come out in a court of law.
So disincentivizes working together.
Exactly, right? So, sometimes decisions are made if there's an international criminal who's committed a crime in Canada, but also in the US or in Australia. Police may say, well, you take the case, right, to another jurisdiction.
Interesting.
So, it may be one of the reasons why we don't see some of these major players ever charged in Canada, including the Canadians, right? You look at the Sam Gore criminal network, is probably like the biggest ever producer of methamphetamine around the world. They mostly have produced it in Myanmar. It's very challenging political environment there, very easy for, producers to, have these super labs in the jungles there. But Sam Gore is headed by a Canadian named Sechai Lop. He's now in custody in Australia. He was extradited just over a year ago from the Netherlands after quite a long battle. He was on his way back to Toronto when he got nabbed there. But, he's considered, they call him the Asian El Chapo, right?
Right, yeah.
Because that's the scale that Sam Gore produced methamphetamine and got it into some of these countries. And at its peak, it's waning a little bit, Sam Gore made between $8 and $17 billion a year from selling methamphetamine.
Wow, all headed by a Canadian.
Right? So, these connections are there, yet none of these people are being prosecuted in Canada.
So fascinating. We have to take one more commercial break, and then I have to ask you why you actually cover this stuff.
Okay.
Thank you to Shelter Point Single Malt Whiskey for supporting local conversations, even when it's dangerous. So, Kim, I made a joke at the start of the show that you came in without a bodyguard, but I am genuinely curious. What attracts you to this very dangerous beat? I mean, you've had murder plots involving you. Thankfully, they didn't pan out, but this must be scary for you, right?
Well, there definitely have been times when I've been a little freaked out over information I get, or, I do usually get like a couple of threats a year that I take quite seriously.
Just a couple of threats a year.
But, fortunately, nothing's happened, right? I mean, I think it's like earthquake preparation in Vancouver, right? Do you have your kit ready, or do you just sort of forget about it because nothing has happened, right? So that's like nothing has happened. I feel like, even within organized crime, some of them begrudgingly accept what I do as long as I'm accurate and fair. But I also do it because I feel like if I didn't, no one else would. And I didn't mean to start covering gangs and organized crime. I had been covering the Air India case for a long time. I, had a lot of police connections as a result. I had some criminal connections as a result of that as well. And when that started winding down, I remember being back from the public inquiry in Ottawa one weekend, and it was October 2007. and the Surrey 6 murders happened, right? So I was out there that weekend, outside of a building where 6 people had been executed, the biggest gangland murder in BC history. It was a short time after that we learned 2 of them were completely uninvolved. And that was Chris Mohan, whose mom Eileen has been an incredible advocate for him, and Ed Schellenberg, a gas fitter, just checking the fireplaces in this high-rise building, and ends up, being executed in the suite. So,
do you think British Columbians or Vancouverites care about this stuff? You hear a lot about money laundering. You hear a lot about cars being stolen. I mean, even on the federal level, they're talking about that. But do you think when it comes to the gangland violence that there's actually a lot of attention paid to it?
I think people pay attention when there's a big incident, right? Or a few incidents, but it's mostly in the context of, gee, I was at the mall and someone got shot in the parking lot. This is scary, right? So unfortunately, it's sort of human nature where people only care if they think it's going to affect them, which is why they care about money laundering, because they're worried about the price of houses, or SUVs are being stolen, and the government tends to jump on that and react. But it's really frustrating for me because so many times you'll hear, oh, well, that was an innocent victim, who got shot. Well, you're not allowed to shoot anyone in Canada.
Right, yeah.
Right? You're not allowed to murder people. And I'm very careful with my journalism students. I say, don't call people innocent victims. Call them uninvolved. Right? Because you're suggesting that if some young 22-year-old is selling some drugs, maybe because he's broke or got roped into doing it, it's okay to kill him. Right. Yeah. And it's never okay.
Terrible logic.
It's never okay. But we don't think it through. Right.
Right.
And I don't think that there is public sympathy for the backstories of young guys that get caught up in this gang world that has exploded here in the last 20 years. Right. I mean, it really, really has. And I'm seeing, young guys that are 22, 23 getting sentenced to 2 life sentences. They don't look very cocky.
No.
Right, in the courtroom. And you hear when they're sentenced, their backstories. Some of them have very tragic lives, right? So, our problem, obviously, it's the violence. Obviously, it's the drugs, the toxic drug crisis here, the crisis we're creating in other countries. But there is a real human toll, with so many lives lost. Because these guys are doing the bidding of these people at the top of the food chain who don't care at all about them.
Right.
Right.
Kim, this was so fascinating, so incredible. I'm a big fan of your work. I do hope that the Vancouver Sun commissions a bodyguard for you at some point. But thank you so much for your time tonight.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Folks, that's our show. Thank you, of course, to our very special guest tonight, Kim Bolan. Please make sure you check out her incredible investigative series, Lethal Exports, which you can find on the Vancouver Sun website, free of charge, absolutely no paywall. We just scratched the surface tonight, so if you want more, you will not be disappointed by the entire 5-part series. We will be back next week. In the meantime, follow me on X or TikTok at VANCOLOUR. Of course, this is VANCOLOUR, and I'm Mo Amir, telling you that in a province where you can be anything, be colorful. Peace.